First of all, thank you for your time for this interview. And yes, we can see a lot of moves now in geopolitical way. So, did Joe Biden move that Ukraine can use long-range missiles provoke Vladimir Putin to respond as a precaution?
So I think that the decision by Biden was not necessarily to provoke Russia into a response. More so, I think there's two primary factors. Number one is that Russia has been making some pretty significant advances, both in eastern Ukraine, but also in the Kursk theater, where Ukraine had made that incursion. And that includes the addition of North Korean troops, which is, unprecedented at this stage in the conflict. So that's number one, to be able to put Ukraine in a position to be able to withstand any planned counteroffensives there and to target, whether it be logistics, weaponry, or the forces themselves. And then the second factor is obviously with the Trump administration coming into power, the Biden administration is trying to put Ukraine in the best possible position for any potential negotiations. So whether that be, using this as a bargaining chip that Trump can negotiate, or perhaps even keep this element for Ukrainian forces if those negotiations become difficult with Russia. So I think ultimately it's trying to basically stop the bleeding on the battlefield and then improve Ukraine's negotiation position in the diplomatic sphere.
So basically, you're saying that this is not using this time to make the last move before the Trump's inauguration.
I think that's part of it. That's definitely a factor in terms of the timing. I also think that we've seen the reason that the Biden administration has been hesitant to make this move until now was the concern over a Russian response, right? That this would be crossing some kind of red lines. I think at this point, we've seen over the past, basically since the conflict began, that any kind of major action, whether that be a nuclear attack, some major conventional attack, Russia has its own constraints in doing that. So I think given the timing that there's only a couple of months left, before the handover of power, all signs seem to be pointing towards Russia and Ukraine heading towards some kind of diplomatic negotiation. So I think that the cost-benefit analysis by the Biden administration finally led them to believe that making this move now would the benefits would outweigh the risks essentially.
Does this mean that the war can escalate in Europe?
I think it's always the possibility that the war can escalate. I will, though, say that such precautions have been made in the past. I think it's worth noting in particular for Sweden and Finland, just the fact that these two countries were recent new members to NATO. So the precautions are, once you're in NATO, that does elevate the threat level from Russia to some degree, right? Now, whether that leads to some major, military escalation, obviously the fact that Putin has signed off on that nuclear doctrine, this was something that was in the works before. So I think that's more posturing personally than a true threat of a nuclear attack. But of course, any time that the West and the US in particular increase Ukraine's military capabilities, increase their ability to strike within Russia, that does have military escalation potential. But I think that this is happening, as I mentioned before, at the same time that we're having a lot of diplomatic movement, or at least the precursors to a major diplomatic deal. So I wouldn't necessarily say that a large-scale military escalation is the highest probability scenario at this point.
So if something bigger happen in Europe, how can that reflect on geopolitical events in the world?
Well, I think we're seeing that play out all of the time in how these different hotspots, these geopolitical hotspots, are interconnected, right? So we've seen, for example, what we discussed, the North Korean element now being introduced into the Russia-Ukraine theater. We've seen how Russia has been collaborating with countries like China, like Iran, also in that theater. That has a direct impact on the situation in Ukraine, that has a direct impact on Ukraine's backers, whether that be from the US and Europe. So we're in a period of a multipolar world where there's a lot of connectivity between these hotspots. So it certainly impacts, the war in Ukraine, the connection of these countries to other theaters. and vice versa, where we see more actors, more hybrid forms of competition and conflict, and the implications that has for throughout the world.
Just one more question. We saw that the announcement of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he said he don't want some escalation, but we can see another candidate like Friedrich Merz. He said that Olaf Scholz need to go from the government. I mean, does Merz want to do some other moves beside Scholz' announcement that he want a peace?
I think, there's obviously internal politics with every single country, whether that be Germany. Obviously, we're seeing within the US the different, trajectories that the support for Ukraine can take. I think none of the European countries and even the US want a military escalation, yet they do want to support Ukraine to put it in the best possible position to succeed. I think it's been made clear that it's going to be very difficult to win this war directly on the battlefield, either for Russia, but certainly for Ukraine, given that it's, the smaller and weaker force and dependent on outside powers. So, but at the same time, I think negotiations are inevitable. There's clear, movement being made on that front. So it's really putting Ukraine in the best position to succeed, or to at least, have to offer the least amount of concessions that would be damaging to its own security and to the European security overall.
Can we see those kind of negotiations in the near future?
Yes, I think we should be seeing them quite early on. We've seen a lot of indications about basically the incoming Trump administration, even the Putin administration making some kind of signals, in terms of what's going to be on the table. Even today, we saw some reports from sources about a potential freezing of the conflict, even Russia potentially willing to let go of some of the territory that it seized in particular areas in southern and eastern Ukraine in exchange for some kind of security guarantees, in exchange for Ukraine's relationship vis-a-vis NATO in particular. So I think that all signs are pointing to those negotiations happening at the beginning of next year. And I mean, if and when that ceasefire agreement will be reached, that obviously remains to be seen. I think there will still continue to be some fighting on the ground. There's still going to be hybrid activity, but I wouldn't be surprised that the conflict shifts into a new phase fairly early on, as early as the first few months of 2025.